this is a consultancy thing from a few years back, but basically it's trying to understand where innovation leadership fits into the puzzle. And this particular study looked at 3 clusters of factors or variables. It looked at things that are trying to capture leadership, things that are trying to capture what we're going to call climate, and then the things that we're talking about throughout the whole thing, the process, having some sort of innovation process. There's other stuff, yeah? But try to look at the interactions. And you find that those 3 things explain a big chunk of the difference between the consistent innovators and those who don't innovate or don't innovate consistently, a sort of random walk, okay? And you found that it was quite a consistent cluster of things. More of that later. So we're really saying there is something there empirically, and the 3 things are linked up quite significantly. Okay, before we move on, if you look at the leadership research findings, what you find is there are many, many studies, but what they tend to do is try to develop either typologies, and a typology is really a theoretical set of types. Yeah, so they say there's only 2 management types, or there's 3, or there's 4, and you get many, many types. So they try to theoretically say these are the 5 types of managers, or these are the 7 types of managers. Yeah, so that's a typology driven by theory. Or they do the reverse almost, and they study thousands of managers, and then they cluster them by similar characteristics. Same outcome, you get different styles, but that's a taxonomy because it's based empirically. Okay, the end result's very similar, that you get there are 2 types of leadership, or there are 3 or 5 or 10 or 12 or whatever. Okay, so one of the big deals in trying to understand leadership is not to identify, I underline, not to identify what's the best leadership practices, but to say what are the different leadership styles or types. Okay, so most of the research is not trying to figure out what makes the ideal leader, but to say what different types of leadership style are there and how does that influence outcomes. And that type of research is quite interesting because only one of the things they're interested in is things like innovation. They're looking at other things as well. Okay, so for the purpose of today, we're just interested in a subset of that research, the stuff that looks at certain leadership styles or types and innovation outcomes. Yeah? Okay, so I repeat, it's not best practice necessarily, but it's how do these different types do it. Okay, and one way of doing that is to break down leadership into different dimensions. And if you do that, and then the different permutations of those dimensions, you get these different leadership styles. They have one characteristic more than another. And obviously the more dimensions you have, the more permutations you get, okay? Okay. One of the simplest ones just has 3 dimensions, okay? And again, this isn't a hierarchy, it's just demonstration of how they do it. So they break down leadership into different dimensions because then it's easier to measure and then it's easier to develop these sort of types. Okay, you have more of that and less of that. You have lots of that and lots of that and none of that. Okay, so one is basically how you go about managing change and innovation. One is a more, on the right-hand side there, as you look at it, one is more sort of incremental, systematic and structured, so-called developer approach to managing innovation and change. So it's all about methodologies, timeframes, plans, structures, yeah? And the other, not better, just different, is a more exploratory approach, yeah? More experimental approach. So it might be less methodology, okay? Fewer plans and milestones, okay? And I repeat, they're just different orientations. And another dimension might be how do you go about problem solving in this sort of pompous terminology, processing. But it's basically problem solving. Yeah? Do you rely on your own expertise and experience and internal focus? Yeah? I'm the expert, I've got 20 years experience, so that's how I'm going to solve the problem, and then I'll identify somebody who can work on it. Or conversely, do you say, look, I'm just a facilitator around here, I identify who's got the relevant expertise and experience, and I try to bring them together to try to fix the problem or to innovate. Yeah, it's a very different orientation. Not better, just different. Yeah? Okay, and the third dimension is ways of figuring out, who you're going to work on the project, who you're going to work with. So are you more task orientated, getting the job done, expediency, have they done it before, what's their experience? Yeah, versus it's more about, I've worked with these people, I have trust in them. They may not be the most experienced, may not be technically the best, but they deliver, blah, 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 yeah? People-orientated. And there are many more dimensions in different sort of theories and such like. But you get the idea. You break down leadership in different dimensions, and then you combine those dimensions, yeah, and you can figure out, well, this cluster of characteristics is likely to have these outcomes. This cluster is not likely to have these outcomes, or is likely to have different outcomes. So we are not seeking best practice. We are seeking matching leadership styles with certain outcomes. And for the purpose of this module, we're more interested in the subset of innovation outcomes. Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Okay, we've said most of that. So we're talking about leadership styles, or if you like, types. You know, I don't care what you call it. Okay, it's not a sort of a unitary thing, if you like. It's got different dimensions, and it works in different conditions. And I guess the other thing before we move on is context. Now, remember when we looked at the process model and we said, look, the process model is pretty generic. You've got to do these 4 things, and you have these 2 contexts, you know, organisation strategy. However, you need to adapt it for different environments. Size of firm, nationality, resources, blah, 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 sector. Same thing happens here. Leadership styles work better or don't work at all under different conditions or contexts. And that's one reason why you don't get leaders moving around different industries very much, or moving from, say, the public sector to the private sector or vice versa, and performing very well. These are not universal leadership traits. It's a myth. Okay, so they don't travel across different contexts very well. Okay, so another thing is figuring out how well do they fit the context that you're in. Okay. Why does all this matter? Well, as we said, innovation leaders, particularly senior leaders, influence the direction of travel. How do they do that? Well, the studies suggest they do it at a very high aggregate. Don't worry about the data necessarily. You can dig out the original paper, the full reference is there. But what it's basically saying is that these sort of senior managers who are responsible for innovation strongly influence where you look, where you search, where you invest, where you put your talent. In this sort of jargon here, it's like the innovation fields in which you're making significant resource commitments, people, money, time. Okay, so the idea is they have a profound influence, good or bad, on the direction of travel for innovation strategy. And that's one of the critical findings. Okay, they're less effective at the product level because they don't get involved at that level. Okay, so the broad direction of travel is largely determined by these guys. Okay, so it's important to figure out, if you like, how their style affects that direction of travel. Okay, so what we're arguing is that the effect of leadership is very, in the jargon, contingent upon, it depends upon several things. One is, if you like, the context you're in, the industry, the types of innovation, such like, yeah, and also the outcomes you're trying to achieve. And if you get that match or that configuration right, you're more likely to outperform than if you get that match wrong. Yeah. So the idea is to match that in terms of the leadership style. And the final bullet point there, which we'll expand upon when we look at climate and teams, is that if you remember, the third role of the innovation leader was to influence the climate. Yeah, and we'll elaborate on that in a moment. And one of the factors in the climate is to influence those who are going to have to do the work. And that is a very large area of research called LMX. LMX sounds like a sort of Australian rock band. LMX is leader member exchange. I know it doesn't add up, but that's what academics do. LMX, okay? And it's a big area of research trying to understand how different leadership styles interact with different groups and teams. Okay, so because often some researchers look at teams, as we'll see in a moment, and different researchers look at leaders. And if you look at the real life events, it's how they interact. Okay, and there's less research in that area. So a big area of research at the moment is this LMX, leader member exchange. It's basically how sort of groups and teams interact with different leadership styles. Okay, and when we get to teams, we'll look at that again. So there's a lot of stuff happening here, but what we're not looking for is what is the best combination of characteristics to promote innovation. What we're saying is how the different leadership styles influence different types of innovative outcome. Yeah? Okay. Which is why you find in real life that these sort of household names perform very well in certain domains and very badly in others. An example, and just one example. There are, as I said, many, many different types of typologies, taxonomies, ways of categorizing leadership styles. So literally tens of these things, yeah? This is probably the simplest one. Well, it's not simplest, that would be 2, yeah? But 3, okay, so it's slightly less simple than the most simple one. But 3 examples of, if you like, types of leadership style. And I repeat, the purpose is not good or bad, but how and in which ways do they affect outcomes? Okay, or put it another way, under what sort of conditions are they more